Good afternoon, everyone. We're ready to get started. Welcome to the public forum session on trade and services for development. Can you hear me? Yeah. We are going to get started with an introductory session by the Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala.
She's trying to make up lost time.
I know. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming back. The room is fairly full, so that's a good thing at this time of the day. And I'm sorry we're starting a bit late, but there's a lot going on. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful to see so many of you here. We have negotiators, policymakers, and representatives from the private sector, civil society, and academia for the WTO's biggest event. And this year is really very, very rich. We're very excited at what is happening. I'm also excited to see you here for this specific session on services. Services trade is at the heart of efforts to reimagine globalization and extend the benefits of trade to more people and countries. Most of you have probably heard me say that the future of trade is services, digital, and green. Please don't get bored. I've been saying this in almost every speech, but it's true. The WTO and the World Bank have joined hands to help developing countries realize the full development promise of services trade. We hope our exchanges today will catalyze new ideas for how to take this work forward. And I have about 8 minutes of remarks, so bear with me. This is a very important subject. Now, I'm quite excited because joining me today are 4 wonderful guests. Indamit, who is a chief economist of the World Bank, a longtime friend, senior vice president for development economics, and I haven't seen him for a few months. So Indamit, good to see you. Richard, Professor Richard Baldwin, I'm just wondering, how can we exploit you so much? You've been with us throughout the beginning of this. Thank you. All of you know Richard Baldwin. He's famous professor of international economics at IMD Business School and one of the foremost scholars in the area of trade and globalization. We also have the pleasure to welcome Mr. Sumanta Chowdhury. Thank you for joining us, Principal Advisor, International Trade Policy at the Confederation of Indian Industry. I'm really, really happy you could make it. Thank you. And of course, DDG Hill, who is responsible for services in the Secretariat and has been at the forefront of our joint work with the World Bank in services trade. Now, I'm going to do what I normally do because it's all well and good to see us up here talking, but I like the people who do the work to be acknowledged. So Shaolin and all her team and all the people working on services who are here, the World Bank team, please stand up so that you can be recognized. Please, I know you're all shy and you don't like it, but I think it's proper. Thank you so much. This session builds on the WTO World Bank report on services that I launched with the World Bank President Ajay Banga in 2023. It was one of the first things that we did jointly together. That report underscored that services trade is now shaping the economic landscape of countries at all levels of development. It pointed to the important role for services trade in building a strong foundation for the digital and green economy, as well as for global development and socioeconomic inclusion. But the report was also a call for action. It called for a trade in services for development initiative and spelled out the broad elements of an aid for trade roadmap aimed at scaling up the capacity of developing countries to participate more meaningfully in services trade and to reap the development dividends. You may know that I don't like producing reports only to let them gather dust. Everybody here knows that. That is why here at this session, we're officially launching the Trade in Services for Development Initiative. Joanna will provide further information on the initiative and how we aim to take this forward, this program of services-focused aid for trade. But let me explain why I think this is incredibly important and why the support for both developing and donor countries is crucial. The data demonstrate that services has been the most dynamic component of world trade since the WTO was established 30 years ago. Between 1995 and 2023, trade in commercial services grew at an average annual rate of 6.8%, compared to 5.5% for goods. And I should make clear that this was despite the blow that COVID-19 dealt to travel and tourism. This dynamism has been turbocharged in recent years by digitalization, which has made it easier and cheaper to supply more kinds of services across borders. Our estimates show that trade in digitally delivered services has quadrupled since 2005, growing at an average annual rate of about 8% to reach $4.25 trillion in value last year, making up more than half of all commercial services exports and 13.8% of total exports of goods and services combined. The share of commercial services in world trade has increased from 19% in 1995 to 25% in 2023. And that's before we count local sales by the established affiliates of foreign services companies. Our best estimates suggest that if we include such trade, the technical term is Mode 3 of the General Agreement on Trade in Services. The services share of global trade in 2022 was closer to 42%. In addition, for developing countries as for rich ones, services accounts for a large and growing slice of economic activity. Today, the services sector generates about half of employment worldwide. It is also the source of most new job creation, especially for female and young workers. With respect to trade, a little-known fact is that commercial services exports from least developed countries and other developing economies have outpaced the world average by a considerable margin since 2005. LDC exports of commercial services have quadrupled, albeit from a very low base, while those from other developing countries have more than tripled. The share of developing countries in world services trade has increased markedly over the last 20 years, now reaching more than a third. Non-traditional sectors, including many digitally delivered services, have registered particularly strong export growth. In other words, the dynamism we see in global services trade has been even more pronounced in developing economies. This runs counter to the export pessimism that has too often characterized debates on services trade and developing countries. There are real-life opportunities behind these statistics. A growing number of jobs are already linked to exports of commercial services. For example, in India, South Africa, and Turkey, jobs directly linked to cross-border services exports account for more than 10% of total service sector jobs. And for some countries such as Costa Rica, cross-border services exports account for over 20% of total jobs. This matters more than ever because developing economies' growth and employment generation prospects lie in services. Manufacturing, which is increasingly capital and skill intensive, will not be able to absorb labor force entrance en masse the way it might have in the past. Enhancing productivity in services sectors will be a key priority for development, and I believe that trade and trade policies can play a very important role in that regard. Moreover, services are vital inputs for economy-wide competitiveness. About 2/3 of world trade in commercial services are not destined for final consumption, by the way, but rather used to produce other goods and services. By improving access to quality and affordable services, increased services trade can help enhance productivity and competitiveness in manufacturing and agriculture. Facilitating and expanding trade in services would support growth and job creation. It would also yield extra dividends for socioeconomic inclusion because in contrast to manufacturing, where most exports are undertaken by larger companies, the lion's share of commercial services exports occurs via micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises or MISMEs. Connecting more MISMEs to international markets spreads the gains from trade more broadly across societies. In addition, services trade can help accelerate the low-carbon transition by allowing economies to access the best environmental services, thus lowering the cost of going green. In a similar vein, facilitating trade and investment in digitally enabling services such as telecom and computer services would strengthen the foundations of the digital economy. So, services will be at the center of future economic growth and trade. But it seems to me that there is a disconnect between the sector's importance and the attention it receives at the WTO, whether in negotiations or with respect to aid for trade. It is time for a rethink. The negotiating front took a major step forward on services domestic regulation, but there's plenty of room for members to boost services trade by updating and improving their Uruguay Round era commitments. On aid for trade, I think the WTO and the World Bank can make a difference. The Trade in Services for Development initiative we are launching here will seek to help developing countries power growth and development by seizing more of the opportunities that services trade offers. As I said earlier, DDG Hill will walk us through the initiative's comprehensive work program, but there are two related plans I want to mention. One is a Trade in Services for Development platform that the WTO and the World Bank are working to create. It will be an online global umbrella platform to promote information sharing, greater coherence, and improved institutional coordination in scaling up services-related activities. The idea is to bring in inputs from international organizations, regional economic commissions, and development banks. The second is a global conference on services trade we are planning to jointly host every 2 years. The conferences will gather together international organizations, government representatives, and stakeholders from academia, the private sector, and civil society to share knowledge on advances and emerging practices. Excellencies, let me conclude by saying that I believe we can work together to convert the development promise of services trade into concrete benefits for people around the world. I ask for your engagement and your financial support, and we already have one wonderful member who is going to give us some support here. Let me just keep quiet for the moment until the moment arrives. But thank you all for listening, and above all, thank you to our stellar panel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ngozi. Is it working now? Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ngozi. I am thrilled to be here today because together with the World Bank, we are taking concrete actions to advance the trade and services for development for the benefit of developing countries. Dr. Ngozi has well spelled out the rationale on why we need to focus on services now and for the future. And while services trade carries great potential and opportunities, harnessing these opportunities can be challenging, especially for developing countries. What are these challenges in a nutshell? Some of them are the heterogeneity of services, with sectors that are differing largely in their key characteristics and in their regulatory intensity. There's also complexity involved because it comes, in different modes of supply, and as well as the wide-ranging measures that can affect trade in services. So these factors sometimes make it difficult for countries to set clear goals for services trade policy, measure the impact of these policies, and identify areas where they could be more competitive or grow their exports in the future. In our joint report, we, the World Bank and the WTO, have identified a broad dimension of an aid for trade initiative in services to help overcome these challenges, unlock the benefits of services trade, and take best advantage of the guarantees that are already offered under the GATS agreement. We have discussed and presented this report with different stakeholders in different regions, and the reaction has been very positive. I want to thank ministers that took part in past events, such as those of the United Kingdom, Rwanda, Jamaica, and Barbados, as well as their ambassadors, and the ambassadors from other parts like the Pacific Islands and Kazakhstan. I also want to take the opportunity to thank UNESCAP, ECLAC, the IADB, SIACA and UNCE, and all other regional organizations and economic commissions with whom we've had discussions and who have offered to collaborate with us to advance this important agenda for developing countries. Also, since the launch of the report, we have seen our teams working in an initial joint Aid for Trade program, which I want to describe for you today. First, we aim to prepare a user-friendly competitiveness diagnostic checklist. Let me repeat that again. A user-friendly competitiveness diagnostic checklist. It's a tool that will help developing countries assess their competitive strengths and weaknesses in services trade, and thus help them define their national services trade policy objectives and identify and prioritize technical assistance needs. Second, we would like to assist interested developing countries in providing greater transparency about core services trade measures. This can be very useful input for diagnostics, but also helps to provide clear policy environment for suppliers and to facilitate domestic authorities' engagement in trade deliberations, both domestically as well as internationally. Thirdly, we need to further build the capacity of developing countries to produce and use statistics on services trade and improve their quality. We want to provide support for data collection efforts by developing countries, and we also plan to organize workshops on measuring services trade, including digital services. And fourthly, a component that I particularly find very exciting, we aim to assist the efforts of developing countries in expanding and diversifying their services exports. In many developing countries, export promotion and investment promotion do not always focus on the area of services. So we want to change this by identifying best practices and adopting them in other regions. And I'm very happy to say that ETLAC and UNESCAP and the IDB have shown particular interest in this aspect of the work program and want to collaborate with the World Bank and the WTO. These proposed new and expanded streams of joint work do not happen in a vacuum, but rather are building upon ongoing efforts that the WTO and the World Bank have been undertaking in the area of services trade. Our joint offering under the Trade and Services for Development also provides for a continuation of these efforts. And this includes, for example, our extensive work on the Services Trade Policy Database, which covers services policies in 34 sectors in 134 economies. We will aim to further expand the country coverage of this comprehensive base of information to the benefit of more developing countries. In addition, we also are involved in assisting developing countries in implementing the new initiative on services domestic regulation, including through the production of a handbook. We hope that this information will be useful. To conclude, the World Bank and the WTO are great partners for carrying out this work. Our expertise and complementary strengths are a recipe for the program's success in its implementation. We will work together to address the needs and interests of developing countries. It provides a good starting point, and we hope that our efforts will bring in more interest and more initiatives to the table. And like Dr. Ngozi, I call on all partners to provide support for this important endeavor. Now, with this framing, I would like to turn to our three distinguished speakers to get their insights on the growing importance of trade and services in the global economy and its continuing development. I will ask a first round of questions and then come back for a second round, and then hopefully the audience will have questions of their own. So, Intermit, I would like to start with you. What is your take on the issue of premature deindustrialization? How does that affect the World Bank guidance on lower-income countries experiencing peak manufacturing employment and transitioning towards services at low per capita income levels? In your view, where and how can LDCs register the largest gains by harnessing services for development?
Got it. So first I want to thank you, Johanna, for those questions, and thanks, Ngozi, for asking me to be here. It's always been inspirational and energizing to be around Ngozi, by the way, and we are all in need for inspiration and energy. So I think, so I was actually speaking with Richard and Sumanta just before we started, and I was telling them that what's really special about Ngozi is that you always feel better about yourself after meeting her than you did before. So it's great to be around Ngozi. So the questions that you've asked are, they essentially get to the heart of this issue that Ngozi raised, that it's time for a rethink on trade policy and economic development. So I guess another way to phrase the question, Johanna, is that, is there just this one narrow path that all countries, low-income countries especially, that are hoping to climb the income ladder, do they have just one path or not, right? So now in the third decade of this century, does it really make sense for these countries to make an all-or-nothing bet, basically, on manufacturing, or is there a better recipe for these countries, right? And so you'll not be surprised by my answer. I think there is a better recipe available, and trade in services is a big part of it and a growing part of it, right? So relative to manufacturing, this category of trade actually continues to get a bad rap among economists especially, right? So services, we are told, are slower to innovate, they're harder to trade, and they're more difficult to free from regulatory restrictions. But just as Ngozi has noted, trade in services is actually transforming the world. So services now account for fully half of global trade in value-added terms, and a couple of years back, it actually accounted for 2/3 of global GDP. This share is growing, not shrinking, right? And so there is widely held belief that this is a part of the economy that is harder to sort of, harder to deregulate, harder to grow in terms of productivity and so on, and the actual facts on the ground don't jive with each other. So I think it's absolutely right for Ngozi to say, let's do a rethink. It's very important, okay? So now to actually start to do this rethink, I think it helps to start with a look at what's happening in countries that have actually seized this opportunity, right? So I know that Richard will give you a global view, and Sumanta will tell you a lot about what's happening in India. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview of a report that the World Bank is producing, which is building on the report that we did with you all, that is from East Asia. And East Asia is a part of the world that always sort of takes advantage of any opportunity and is doing that again, right? So I'm going to give you a report that's called Services Unbound, and it was written. It has been written by a team that's led by Aditya Mattu. Aditya Mattu, by the way, the chief economist of our East Asia and Pacific region. He started his career here at the WTO, so the WTO can take credit for a lot of the work that he does. Okay. Now, we all know that countries in East Asia and the Pacific use manufacturing and trade as a springboard for growth, right? And they were considered textbook examples of the manufacturing-led model of growth. But if you look at them today, their needs and their circumstances are not quite what they were 50 years back or even 30 years ago. Their populations, for example, are aging very, very quickly. So they are adapting also very quickly. And a big part of the adaptation is the greater emphasis on services. Right? So services as a share of economic activity in developing East Asia has grown in the last decade or so from 44% to 52%, very rapid increase. And it is a growing part of trade, just like Ngozi, just as you said it, it's both a growing part of the economy and a growing part of the trade. Now, and opening up services to competition, and you largely do that by opening up services to trade as well, right? Has meant higher labor productivity, not just in services, but also in manufacturing and farming, because firms and farms can now check prices, they can deliver goods, and they can receive payments much more efficiently, and that's driving income growth, right? So I'll give you a few examples. So across all of the major economies in developing East Asia and the Pacific, services now contribute more than manufacturing to overall labor productivity growth. Okay. In Vietnam, for example, value added per worker increased by about 3% per year after the government eased restrictions on foreign entry and ownership in several services sectors. That's between 2008 and 2016. And by the way, these reform commitments were those made when Vietnam acceded to the WTO. So the WTO played a big role in that. The second thing is that if you look at services growth, they've also been closely tied, as Ngozi mentioned, closely tied to the spread of digital technologies. And that is yielding big benefits for East Asian countries. So first, it is helping on the FDI front, Ngozi. In most countries in East Asia, the growth of FDI in services exceeded the FDI growth rate in manufacturing by a factor of 5. Okay. The second is that it's driving demand for educated workers, right? So close to 40% of formal digital workers in East Asia have a university degree or higher, and that is double the rate for workers in other sectors, okay? And the third part is that it's increasing opportunities for women. The ratio of women to men tends to be higher in the services sector in the manufacturing thing. But what you also find is that the advantages for women actually grow as the level of development increases, and is large part because the services sector modernizes, becomes more productive, becomes more efficient. So now I go back to your question, okay, and I say, okay, should we be worried about deindustrialization or premature deindustrialization and so on? So should we worry, as Danny Roderick said a few years ago, that developing countries are turning into service economies without having gone through the proper experience of industrialization? And the answer is, I don't think so. Yeah. The countries that have seen the greatest growth in services, Johanna, tend to be dynamic countries. They tend to be countries that today you find are actually either high-income countries or upper middle-income countries. Okay, and this includes many of those in East Asia that I mentioned. So I'm just going to end with a few quick facts. So in upper middle-income countries, services have gone from a 40% share in GDP in 1970 to about 50% today. Okay, so that's not that's a big increase, but over a long period. But the better a country does, the quicker this ratio has gone up. So over the past decade alone, services grew from a 44% share of economic activity in China to 53%. Massive increase. Services now actually account for nearly 50% of employment in China, and that's up from 35% just a decade ago. Okay? Now, this ratio has gone up in other countries of East Asia, but since many of them didn't do nearly as well as China, that ratio has not gone up as fast as it did in China. But it has gone up from 44% to 48% just in the last decade. Okay, all these numbers are going to come out in a really nice report that we are going to put out very, very soon, our East Asia region. But then, just to conclude, if you look at low-income countries, Johanna, services as a share of GDP are still roughly what it was in 1970. So that's about 40%. So in these countries, actually, most services jobs are actually all tend to be low productivity subsectors and so on. So I would actually turn that question around. So, right, it's not obvious that it's premature deindustrialization is underway in these low-income countries. I think it would be better classified as zero development. Okay. And let me stop there.
Thank you, Intermit. And the focus then on services trade for development is an accurate one. Let me turn to Professor Richard Baldwin. I'd like to ask you, what's ongoing in the shifts in the world economy that is allowing developing countries to assign a more central role in services in their growth and development trajectories.
Thank you very much for that, Jonan. Let me first thank you, Ngozi and Johanna, for having me here and allowing me to share my ideas with this audience. It's a topic that I have been working on for a while. The last chapter of my 2016 book is where I first started talking about it. You didn't think I was going to come here and not plug my book, did you?
We're all plugging books.
Okay. Okay. So, and I also applaud the report and the program for countering what I like to call the fixation on manufacturing, or when my mouth is agile enough, manufacturing mesmerization. People, policymakers, economists are fixated on industry. It's absolutely astounding how people think that every country now should develop the way the G7 countries develop, following export-led industry, and how all the newly emerging markets like China, India, whatever, did, Korea, Japan. But what I want to do with my 3 minutes or so is lay out 3 facts that I think are absolutely decisive when talking about service-led development. So the first one is it's harder to grow your exports of manufactured goods today. And this is the theme of all of my comments, and it's what Dermot said and Ngozi said. We're not living in the world of 1990. Things have changed. The opportunities for trade and development have changed. Now, why did it become harder to expand your exports? First of all, the world demand for manufacturing exports has stagnated since 2008. Most of what people call globalization is a slowdown in the exports of manufacturing. And since the world is autarkic, a slowdown in the export of manufacturing means a slowdown in the import of manufacturing. So the demand for your exports is growing systematically slower now since 2008, and that makes it harder for everybody. The second is China dominates manufacturing with an unmatchable agglomeration economies. China now produces more than the next 9 largest countries put together. China is quite simply the only manufacturing superpower in the world. If you add up what the US, Germany, Japan, Korea, all those and more, China produces more in terms of gross terms. Now, what that means is if you're hoping to get into that area, you're having to compete with an agglomeration base that has never been this big, at least not since the early 1800s, when England ruled the roost. Even in 1990, the G7 did not dominate manufacturing the way China does now. Moreover, China is dominating especially the lower end of the manufacturing where many emerging markets are hoping to get in. So you can't do it because China did it first. That's the reality. The world is not fair. Nobody ever said it would be. Point number 2, emerging economies' share of world services exports is low but growing fast. And all of you have said that and agreed to it. So think about work from home when home is abroad. If you believe work from home is here to stay, you believe in service-led export development. Because globalization in the end is about arbitrage. When the price of things costs different in different countries, companies arbitrage those differences by making it where it's cheap and selling it where it's not. And right now, there's an enormous arbitrage in the wage cost of service workers around the world. And digital technology is making it easier to arbitrage those differences. In essence, it's telework or telecommuting, but moving internationally because it'll be very profitable. Or to put it in a buzzword, digital tech is making it feasible, wage differences are making it profitable. So it's going to happen. And it's happening, as Ngozi mentioned and the report mentions, much faster from emerging markets than for developing countries. Last, manufacturing export-led growth is dying. Service export-led growth is booming. That's a fact. Things changed around 2008. When the value added of exports grow faster than overall GDP, that's what I define as export-led growth. And if you look at the facts, up to 2008, 70% of middle-income countries, nations experienced manufacturing export-led growth, and only 10% experienced service export-led growth. Since 2008, that's turned around. Now, after 2008, only 40% had manufacturing export-led growth, 70% had service export-led growth. So de facto, service export-led growth is happening. So the point is not whether you like it or you don't like it. Danny Roderick doesn't like it, but he doesn't think there's an alternative. The reality is it's happening and the other way isn't possible. So we have to adapt to this new reality. Moreover, we should stop thinking what can we do to make service export-led growth more like manufacturing export-led growth? Those two models will not look alike. They will require different policy, different mindsets. Services are in cities, factories aren't. Services require infrastructure. Services require very little service structure. Manufacturing is about technology and capital. Service export is not. It's about training. So we have to stop thinking that service-led export development is somehow secondary to manufacturing and start saying this is the way it is going to happen, and then start to see how we should do about it. And that's why I like the program in particular. So I'll stop my speech right there, sorry. I get excited about these things.
Good things to be excited about.
Thank you so much, Richard. And to round off and give us a national and industry perspective, Sumanta, since you are a services expert and now with the private sector of India, we'd like to know how you see the role of services trade in providing opportunities for the private sector in developing countries, drawing from your experiences, and the contribution of services trade in development strategies. Is there an evolution of how services trade is being perceived, and what can we learn from India in this regard?
Let me also begin by thanking DG and Johanna for inviting me to this panel, and thanks for the question. I will not repeat a lot of what Richard and Indomeet have said, and I agree, but let me say three things, three trends which are absolutely change the perspective of the services contribution. One is when services came into the WTO fold and virtually into the international fold in '94, the bulk of services trade was Mode 3 or commercial presence. And developing countries in particular, at that point of time, most of them being capital deficient, did not see huge opportunities in services trade. Their interests were often limited to a certain subset of Mode 4. Today, this world has changed completely drastically to the sense now today, in the last few years, and this trend has been continuing for some time, cross-border delivery, or Mode 1 as we normally understand, is becoming in some sense the more dominant growing mode. And this has provided that extra platform perhaps to developing countries where you are not just dependent on the fact that you need commercial presence. And so this is the first point. Second, of course, has been made that services today is not just important in itself, but it's an enabler for the entire economy. If you look at global value chains, services component of a global value chain and the intellectual property is often more than the good. And therefore, you have these terms, servicification of manufacturing. So therefore, for the entire economy, services today has become pivotal, both as the enabler and as the platform. The third, and I think Indomeet referred to it in the context of FDI, services sector, and this is true even of India, is by far, in fact, 2/3 of FDI comes into services sectors, which brings with it the opportunities for the private sector, for joint ventures, for partnerships, and all kinds. So this is one reason why I think services trade, the entire perspective has changed. And let me take some examples from the Indian context. And we were talking of, today India's share in global services exports is 4.6%, and it's been increasing, while our share of manufacturing is still hovering around 2. If you look at our own domestic projections of exports, the official government target for exports of goods and services is $1 trillion each in 2030. So you're actually expecting that your merchandise and services exports will actually be more or less, I mean, it's of course a tall order. The CAGR that you require is huge, but the fact is the realization that in fact services trade will become almost as important as merchandise trade, and perhaps in the years to come, at least in the case of India, it will overcome merchandise exports. So that's the first thing. The second, of course, is let me just take, since it's also talking about, the issue of inclusivity, the growth of the IT/ITES sector in India, which we all know and has been well documented, but maybe just some quick figures. First of all, the Indian IT technology software industry contributes about 7% of India's GDP. Its share in the total services exports is almost half. But interestingly enough, this has also become, it's opened up new vistas. And you have these stories about Bengaluru and Hyderabad and other centers in India with this young mobile IT crowd, which has changed the tone of consumerism also in India, apart from, and created the need and necessity for huge IT training institutes. And we have a huge network of that. You have 38,000 plus tech firms in India and 31,000 plus tech startups in India doing very well in this particular sector. Women employees account for almost 38 to 40% in this total industry, which is obviously larger than any other. And then one very interesting feature is that while it started off largely in the bigger cities and what we call the metropolitan cities of India, it's now spread to what are called Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. And they have brought with them prosperity, they've brought with them innovation, they've allowed newer places. And when you do this, the whole city infrastructure has grown. So it's actually become a catalyst for growth. And I think this is something that is happening. And the talent in these Tier 2, Tier 3 cities is something that is now developing hugely. So obviously, these are all important imperatives for a development strategy for India. So these are some of the, and I think just one or two lessons that I would draw, particularly having been a former services negotiator, is that very often this question arises of where do you place, on the one hand, services, liberalization, the regulatory frameworks, and all of that. And frankly, while there is no one fit, in the Indian case of the IT, they all moved almost simultaneously. The sector, the telecom sector, and so on, saw huge liberalization. The TRAI, which is the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, came into being around the same time, in '97. And the spectrum allocation, which is the crux of telecom infrastructure, happened about the same time. So you timed all these in some sense, and with that arose also, as I said, a whole ecosystem of skilling the young population for IT. And all this happened in some sense simultaneously. So not that perhaps this is the only model that will work, but this is also a lesson that we have learned, that perhaps doing one at the cost of the other is not the best way, and you need to do it even if it's the hard way. And sometimes hard decisions are called, but perhaps you need to do this simultaneously. I will end with one last part, and that is the importance of digital public infrastructure. Now, this has completely changed or revolutionized, not just development, but quality of life in India. Through either the well-known UPI payments interface, which has now become almost, there are at least 10 or 15 countries who have adopted this payments interface system. And then you have this unique, what you call the identification system, which is Aadhaar, which is, again, biometric-based, IT-based. But this has revolutionized the provision of development benefits to those who actually need it. So that's one other factor, I think, which has really helped these services to become an integral part of the development strategy.
Thank you so much,
So I
Sumanta.
have a two-hander on. So I have a two-hander on what Sumanta just
Yes,
said.
please.
I don't know if
Go
you
ahead.
wanted. So I was actually. So I've been following the back and forth on the book that Raghu Rajan just wrote, right? About services versus manufacturing and so on. And I thought what's really interesting in India is, again, it's become, exactly as Richard said, it's become this thing between India should do manufacturing, India should do services, and so on. But what you just said, Sumanta, you said two things. One of them was you said that India has laid this digital foundation, which is very, very good, which is a very vertical concept, Ngozi. It's not a,
Yes.
I mean, it's a very horizontal concept.
It cuts across everything.
The second thing that India has done, it's also done another horizontal thing. India's hugely investing in infrastructure. And this infrastructure is not favoring manufacturing or service, and again, a horizontal thing, right? And then, of course, India had also done a pretty good job of unifying taxes, right? Which is again a horizontal thing, right? And so I was sort of thinking about it more and more, and I was thinking, like, when you're talking about trade in services, when you're talking about productivity in services and so on, what you really require actually is another horizontal initiative, which is education. So if India does that one, boy, India is going to really develop very, very fast, you know?
Absolutely.
So since we are now actually having a conversation, can I also have a one-hander? But hasn't India done it, and this was the question, by laying down the infrastructure of the IITs? It started that, and I think that was really sort of a backbone that led to this, and now this has grown and grown and grown. But I want to ask all of you, with this, what baffles me is why services jobs then have this reputation, particularly in some developed countries, of not being good jobs. There's some stigma attached to services jobs that gives them a bad name. But if you look at the human resources required for the kinds of services jobs we are talking about, it's not at all that. So how do we overcome this, and how did it come to be? I know you said low productivity, Richard, in developing in poorer countries, and this could be true. But overall, it's not that, it's not such lower productivity than some low-end manufacturing jobs. So, I mean, how is this? From all three of you, I want to hear, how did this come about? How do we overcome it?
Well, I can take a bash at it by citing a World Bank report, actually. A few years ago, there was this report called In Your Service, ? Which was one of the first, service-led development's been a thing that people have been talking about, Aditya, for a long time. It's just nobody listened. And this World Bank report, In Your Service, has a...
At your service.
At your service. At your service, ? Was a kind of play on words, like, can we do this or not? And it had a whole series of facts, including on the productivity. So the standard thing is that services is dead end because the productivity doesn't advance as fast. Because manufacturing being a controlled environment, you can every year get 2 or 3% more out of the same thing. It's all very controlled. Services, it's offices, it's hard to know who's doing what. So you did not see that in the rich countries. But now, especially since 2008, what you see is in East Asia, manufacturing has faster productivity growth, and in the rich countries. But everywhere else, it's even or faster in services. At least in part of the reason, the things I said, is manufacturing has been a very bad business for most countries in the world because the market's declining and China is rising. Those two things made it not a good place to be, but service is the other way around. So I think the productivity numbers are turning around.
Yeah.
And that other thing I think it's worthwhile pointing out is that many, many emerging markets have a problem with educated, unemployed people, young people in cities. And this is an especially important way to get them jobs. So that's, I would leave it at that.
And also to something that you were all mentioning about the digital infrastructure that's necessary. We realize it too at the WTO, and that's why we have partnered with the World Bank again to launch the Digital Trade in Africa work as a starting point. Obviously, we want to take to other regions of the world, because we do recognize the importance of having the hard infrastructure and the soft infrastructure in the digital economy so that they can leapfrog and take advantage of all the other opportunities that we're talking about today.
I just have a quick to end on that one. So when I asked the Indians about how much did the World Bank help them on the digital side, they gave me a very polite response, which was, I think it was close to zero, Ngozi, yeah. So I think one of the things, what would be very good is that you actually get the World Bank to help broker, to actually bring in India into it, because India has done more on the digital at its per capita income level than I think any other country has, on a scale that is unprecedented. So,
Well, this takes me to the almost second part of the program, which is, a little bit about partnerships. And it's a great way to maybe ask if Ambassador Manley from the UK would take a second and take the floor and talk a little bit about the initiative, because the UK has been supporting us, and we'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you very much, Deputy DG. I think, first of all, this panel is exactly the reason that I love the public forum so much, because you're bringing such insight and challenge and such a spirit of collaboration, and the same spirit of collaboration that we see in this initiative too. And insight and challenge, because I think what you're telling us in broad terms is that we have neglected services in this organisation, and we have neglected the contribution that services can make to development. And not just any old development, but more inclusive development by offering those opportunities, say, to Indian workers, Indian women workers in particular. And we really like this initiative. And in fact, we like this initiative so much that I'm really pleased to announce that we're going to be providing $1 million of funding this year to the initiative. And we hope that that money will provide the sort of data that's going to ensure that we take the evidence-based decision-making in this organisation that will enable us to use greater openness on services to developing countries to enable that better trade for a better world. So thank you very much.
I knew you were providing something, Simon, but I didn't know it was that much. Wow. Wonderful. Thank you so much. This is a real surprise. I think we need to send a special letter to the Treasury. Thank you. And, Indamit mentioned partnering. In the countries we are working on, we don't mind partnering. If India wants to partner, is willing to partner, and the countries are willing to accept this, why not? I think it could make for good tripartite relationships. But I'd also like to learn a little bit about, there's a lot of hesitation. India has some very good ideas on some services, kinds of negotiations or approaches they would like to see at the WTO, but very hesitant on others. I don't mean to put you on the spot. You're not the ambassador. I don't know if Senthil is here. But how do you see this development that you have, this digital public infrastructure, the explosion in services, in relationship to the rest of the world? How do you see the other parts of the world benefiting from this, especially other developing countries who don't have the size and scale of India and who may need much more than being a large economy to be able to get the benefits? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, thank you. But of course, DG, having been a former negotiator, you also know how to get out of the spot. No, jokes apart. Of course, frankly, first of all, I don't speak for the Indian government now. I am no longer part of the government. But I think there are three issues here that are important. I'll come with the last question first. The digital public infrastructure becomes, and as Indamit said, it's a horizontal cross-cutting thing which allows seamless use of IT platforms for any purpose. It could be payment, it could be, public utility services, and anything else, and trade as well. And so therefore the one is that if such systems with, of course, due modifications also have adaptations elsewhere, then it becomes easier to transact and do business, including financial payments, if you have a similar payment interface. So it's almost like a domestic transaction that you do if you have similar systems. So that's one major advantage. The second, I think, and here I come from the perspective of the private sector, and that's one of the reasons why perhaps in developing countries, the private sector has not come forward. ITS is one, but if you look at the broad range, is what I would call the asymmetry of information available in public domain between merchandise trade and services trade. And it's actually a very, very difficult task for either a potential services supplier or a new services supplier to find out what kind of policy regimes actually exist, and whether it's in FDI policies and so on. So this is perhaps an area where I think if work can be done, it's helpful not just for negotiations, it's important for drawing your own domestic services roadmaps, because unless you know, one, where your competitiveness lies, where the opportunities lie, that kind of information, of course, I think the WTO, the World Bank, the OECD is doing a lot of work, but there still remains, I think, a lot of work to be done. The third is in terms of course, I agree that given the sort of overwhelming importance and broad sweep of services, and I'll take just one, in the Uruguay round, and of course the services division is here, you found this technologically unbound in mode 1 across schedules of commitments of every country, because a large number of services you regarded as non-tradable unless you just had capital. But today, the whole world scenario has changed, and as we speak, more and more services and more goods are getting converted into cross-border digital delivery. And business models, therefore, are completely changing. And I think this business model change sometimes, I think, perhaps needs better understanding, needs better experience sharing, so that I think within the WTO community, this could become something that is replicable on a much larger scale. Thank you.
Thank you. So that gives us a lot of work for the research division, but also for the Council of Trade and Services, of experience sharing and looking at the future. We are kind of running out of time. I'd like the public to maybe ask a couple of questions. But before that, maybe I could give each speaker a couple of minutes for some closing thoughts, and then take some questions from the audience, if that's okay. Dr. Ngozi, could we start with you? Yes.
My closing thoughts is just how interesting, the evolutions we're seeing in certain aspects of trade are. And, how they are not so visible and known. And, how this could change perhaps the perception, when we say the manufacturing fixation. Yes, to some extent, that's going to happen. And, China will eventually be phasing out of some of these manufacturing jobs also. So they'll go somewhere. But boy, the opportunities in services are changing, are so interesting and so different. So my thought immediately goes to action. I'm always thinking about how are we going to be the catalyst at the WTO to really help poorer developing countries. I'm not thinking of juggernauts like India who are ahead and who don't maybe need any of that. But how are we going to do it so that they can really benefit from this organization's, support and action as a catalyst to make things happen. Hopefully, through this initiative, the general support we're receiving from the UK that is going to help us make this happen. That's where my mind is going. It's racing. How can we do this and do it better? We are determined to try. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard?
Thank you very much. So first of all, let me just again thank the UK for that. The data in trade and services is horrible. The UK has okay, US has okay, but most of the world is terrible. And this getting the data ahead will make an enormous difference in the way. And the funny thing is that since services are so important in our domestic economies, we do a much better job of measuring services domestically, including through value-added taxes and all that sort of thing. So I think that's really great. Now let me make one point which I think is important, is underemphasized, and that's the difference between B2C services and B2B services. So we have our mode 1 and 2 and whatever, even up to mode 5 now. But that's like looking at whether it's the refrigerator is shipped by air or sea or by road. The main thing is who's it sold to, especially in services, because there are enormous barriers to selling services to consumers. There are almost no barriers to selling services to other companies. So distinguish between what is B2C and what is B2B is making a huge difference. Then I want to end with 2 quick conjectures. First of all, simultaneous speech translation will have an enormous impact on this. Language barriers are an enormous barriers to trade. You could do estimations, and they're often up to 20, 30% less trade with people who don't speak the same language. And if you've ever done business, which I've never done, but I have a wife who does business, they have to talk all the time. And if they don't talk the same language, it's much harder to do business. Simultaneous speech translation will be a reality very soon, like this year or next year. It's already beta versions. And that will mean that those 8 million engineers graduating in China will be speaking good enough English next year. It'll open up the floodgates of talent. The second is generative AI, ChatGPT. One of the things we've seen in the research is it levels up skills. It's trained on the best and given to the rest. And thank you very much. I spent a long time on that one. So if you look at an international context, that means the skills of G7 service workers will now be partially transmitted, the experience, to emerging market skill workers, the service workers. So the substitutability of local G7 workers and emerging market service workers will be greatly boosted by simultaneous speech translation and Gen AI. That's just around the corner. So I'll stop with that.
Can I just ask you then? Sorry, I know we're rounding up, but it's stimulating my mind. So then, isn't it also that these emerging market skilled workers, there could be another issue of substitution for G7 developed country skilled workers, and is that going to become another problem? And will we see barriers to those substitutability, because that's where the developing countries could have an edge.
So I think that there will be an upheaval. The Globotics Upheaval is the title of my 2019 book, and it's in part because the export of services will lead to kickback from servicers. We haven't seen that yet, even though the services are growing very fast, but maybe it will come. But if you think about what are they going to do? How do you block service exports? The answer is it's very, very hard to do, as people are finding out who want to get around the digital moratorium. It's just hard to do that sort of stuff. It's the same problem of why it's so hard to tax services with value-added tax. It's hard to know where it's coming from. It's not hard to know how much it's worth. So what are you going to do? Check every email? It could be $1 million of value added in one email, and you didn't check it. So it just goes through. So that's why. The other thing is regulation. And regulation is why B2C is so difficult, but B2B is facing a different political economy. The people buying the services do not want protection. And unless the workers organize, and service workers like these aren't organized in the G7 countries, it will be very hard to get protectionist legislation or regulation. But maybe with privacy, maybe security. There's a few things that could happen, but it has been very hard to do. And let me just end by saying India did its service sector export miracle without a single free trade agreement in services, even before services were a thing in the GATT WTO. So because it was B2C, there were no barriers. It was only technology. So that's why I think maybe they'll kick back, but I don't know how they're going to do it, at least not in the beginning. It's also very different in geopolitical terms, so it's aside from that.
Thank you.
There are many changes coming, and it's time. Many changes coming in time for another small commercial. And so the Director General has wanted to explore this type of issue further, do more research on trade and frontier technologies. And so we're going to be opening up a unit on digital trade and frontier technologies to really look at what's going to be happening, what is happening, and better serve members in these type of issues. So Sumanta, maybe you can give us your thoughts. We still have time. I don't want to rush anybody.
Just two quick points. One, of course, is maybe some specifics on the Aid for Trade program itself. And I think one of the issues which Indermeet raised, and I think it's particularly critical for services, is the skilling and the huge reskilling and upscaling that's required simply to stay up with technology. And if developing countries are not able to do this, then they are going to slide down that ladder. So I think within the mandates and so on, identification of those skill needs, and then perhaps looking at how in partnerships with the private sector you could do this. I think this could be a very, very critical enabling component of this Aid for Trade. The second one, as I largely said, is to have information tools. And let me give another example. We were trying to actually map the Mode 4 commitments in different trade agreements, which are largely categories of natural persons, with the visa or work permit categories in different countries, because you don't have, and there's no concomitance or concordance. So it's almost impossible to know, while I've got a commitment, a market access, what is the visa or work permit that I am entitled to as part of that preferential trade agreement as well. So this also, I think this is just an example, but perhaps this is the kind of work that will really help the private sector to get motivated into services trade. And finally, I think, certainly to conclude, certainly I think services needs more discussion, needs more attention and focus, both domestically and in international forums. Thank you.
Very good, very good. So I just had a quick reaction to the first was a reaction to what Ambassador Manley said. So I thought that the response from Ngozi was so gracious, but my thought, Ngozi, was far less generous, because my first question was, why did he say $1 million? Why didn't he say 1 million pounds? Okay. So maybe I misheard. Maybe it was 1 million pounds, in which case it would be good. Okay. But, exactly. I haven't been a negotiator, obviously. But the other thing I wanted to sort of plug is a World Bank report that we just published last month. Johanna, it's called the World Development Report, and it's on the middle income trap. And so this is about the 108 countries that the World Bank classifies as middle income. And these countries are basically about 75% of the world's population now. They are about 45% of the world's output. They are about 2/3 of the world's emissions. And they're actually a sizable part of the share of the world's extreme poor, actually greater than 50%. So we are still talking about a large number of poor people living in these places. But the thing about these countries is that all of the things that we are talking about, the trade in services, trade generally, the future of the world and so on, all of those things, all of those battles are going to be won and lost in these countries, okay? So I think, so what we tried to do, Ngozi, was try to sort of go back into this term that Homi and I had come up with almost accidentally in 2007, when you were still at the World Bank, which is the middle income trap. So we tried to sort of say, what is it that these countries can actually do about it? So I don't have enough time to sort of go into the report itself, but there are lots of summaries of it. The most recent one was by Martin Wolf in the FT recently, and there's some in The Economist as well. So I suppose that you can actually take a quick look at it. But there's just one aspect that I wanted to emphasize, which was that, we talk about these sort of three things that these countries have to do. One is to discipline incumbents, because you actually have to have change. And so The second one is to reward merit, and this is, I mean, especially the merit of traditionally folks who've been kept out of important jobs, kept out of, I think we're talking about women, we're talking about less advantaged people, especially. And then the third one is to capitalize on crises. So we are talking about Korea, of course, the crisis of 1997-98, but you can also go back a little bit and look at India's trajectory, and India also capitalized on a crisis that it had in the early 1990s. But when it comes to disciplining incumbents, one of the things that we find is that we tend to pay a lot of attention to the size of firms. So we tend to vilify large firms, we tend to coddle small and medium enterprises and so on. And more of the analysis, when we look at it, what we find is that this sort of obsession with firm size is misplaced. Firm size is a superficial indicator of the thing that we are really trying to get at. We are trying to get at value added. And so there are actually better measures of value added than firm size. There is value added. You can actually look at that. So I think that's the more important one. And then when you look at that, when you find, it's a very difficult thing to actually discipline incumbents, especially the large firms and so on. But it's very critical in the thing. And that's where I think trade and services comes in, because services is a bigger and bigger part of economic activity. And you can actually have very large incumbents in the services sector too. Without trade, it's going to be very, very difficult for countries to actually make sure that you can keep things competitive. Okay? So trade and services is going to end up being a huge part of this. And I think that, and that sort of makes us a little bit pessimistic, because given the nature of the discussion around the world on global trade and so on, given the fact that it's actually going in a direction, it will hurt developing countries more than it'll hurt developed countries, and it'll hurt small developing countries more than it'll hurt large developing countries. So for these 108 countries, things are getting tougher, not easier.
Thank you very much. And now we would like to take some questions or quick comments from the audience. Yes?
Audible? Yes. Hi, good evening to the panel. My question is, given AI's rapid integration into the services sector, is it important now for creating international standards and guidelines for ensuring consistency across borders?
The answer is yes, but who knows how to do it?
So the answer is yes, and we are just starting to scratch the surface on that, Richard. Our next World Development Report is actually going to be on standards and development. It's a part of, I think it's a part of development that economists don't understand at all. I think the private sector understands it much, much better than we do.
We should talk to you, because that's something we also do here, standards and development. But the issue is whether on this one, we're equipped. But it would be good to have a good conversation about it.
That was part of the reason why I came. Of course, I can never say no to you when you ask me to come, but that was part of the reason why. Yeah.
Over here? Yes, sorry. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. So we heard that the services statistics are not good outside the UK and US.
Sorry,
and so
can you just say your name and where you're coming
Sanya
from?
Reed Smith, Third World Network. And so presumably it's especially difficult in developing countries with large informal economies. How do you know how many women who have a roadside stall selling fruit will lose their job if you liberalise the supermarket sector? So we saw in India, for example, they were calculated to lose up to 5 million jobs in 5 years if they liberalised the retail sector. And we heard that the barriers to services exports via Mode 1 are because of lack of infrastructure like electricity and fast enough internet in developing countries and least developed countries. So unless that is improved, how can they take advantage of any liberalisation of services in Mode 1? I mean, the $1 million is very nice, thank you, but it won't provide much electricity and internet infrastructure across all of Africa. So until developing countries and LDCs receive enough of this electrification and internet infrastructure, if you liberalise services here in the WTO through improved Uruguay round commitments, wouldn't the beneficiaries of that be the richer countries who have the infrastructure, who are able to export services digitally? Thank you.
So this is not a silver bullet for all the world's problems. And manufacturing export-led development is even harder for the least developed countries. This is not a solution for that. Service-led export is about middle-income people in middle-income countries. You need steady electricity. You need an internet connection. You need a device, and you need some skills that are recognizable in offices somewhere else. And that makes you middle class in this world. So that's where it's going to start, just like it did in Bangalore, which was a middle class people in a middle income country. What we're going to see, and you may like this one, Simon, Bangalore's galore. This is going to come through cities all over the world. It will not help people who don't have steady electricity device or the skills to do something. We have to figure out something else for them. Now, there are some very low-end skills like data entry or checking receipts against forms and things like that, but they still need steady electricity and steady internet connection and a device. So I very much applaud if you want to move this in the lower ends of society in middle-income countries or the least developed countries, you're going to need a lot more classic development infrastructure. And UNCTAD, I think, has a quite elaborate policy on this digital stuff. So they have been working on it, but we need more. And $1 million would, that would be nothing in this world. You're talking a lot more than that. But thank you for that point.
Can I comment on that, though? I think it's a very good point that is being made. We're finding that in many of the the poorer countries, there are niches. You're finding young people are just not waiting, okay? They're finding ways and means, the skills. It's amazing to me. In many African countries, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, you just have these places, in urban areas mostly, I buy that, where this is just stripping ahead. Okay, they are developing payment systems and services and other types of skills and deliverables and apps that you cannot think about. So the issue to me is, if that is the case, how do we try to match? So I buy what you're saying. It's not a big scale thing. But on the other hand, I say to myself, how can we help make it possible? And that requires going back to basics, which is what you're saying. But then we should. The government should pay attention. Even India is building infrastructure at a fast rate, investing. We should be investing in this infrastructure. We should be asking the World Bank to please take another look at your country programs to see what you can do in these very countries. That's the whole issue about the digital divide approach we're taking to a few pilot countries, to ask ourselves, in some countries where the country program allows at the World Bank, can they put in more money into this kind of infrastructure? So that's what we're trying to do.
Back there, the gentleman on the left and then the lady. Yes.
Hi. Hi, everyone. My name is Sergio Martinez, here with the University of St. Gallen. So I have a question about for developing countries to build their comparative advantages, but also technological advantages to seize the arbitrage opportunities in the reglobalization driven by services. How can developing countries do it in a way that they become not only consumers, but producers of those services that perhaps will be more complex and sophisticated, driven by digital technologies? Thank you.
Yeah, well, they put me on the panel to answer the questions. Nobody else wanted to. They all know the answers, but they don't want to say it. So, no. Let me put it this way. I did a study on telemigration, or which I like to call this stuff, for Colombia a couple years ago. And with it, lined up with two Colombian labor economists to line up the U.S. wages with the Colombian wages in all the industries that were, or sectors of service sectors were classed as workable from home by Dingle and Neumann. And the wage difference was 15 times on average, 1,500% higher in the United States than in Bogota, or where most of the work was from. So the arbitrage is enormous. And the people who are taking account of this relatively low-level stuff is the business processing outsourcing industry, which is growing very, very fast. So if you want to see the container ships of service exports, it's the business processing sourcing sector. And Accenture has a competitiveness index about it and is trying to help lots of countries do it, so they're talking about it. And there, for the upgrading, they talk about going from BPO to KPO, which is knowledge processing outsourcing. And this transition is something that people have studied, but I can't summarize in 30 seconds or at all. But look at ways that this is happening now. Think about what's doing well, and then I would go with it. And I would also, again, point out that much of what India did not involve government initiatives at all. It was the private sector that took off and arbitraged this. Lots of skilled engineers from the IITs, when California needed tons of them, and the private sector, they set up multinational corporations and stuff, just took off. So we don't necessarily have to look at what the government can do, but look at what the BPO sector and the KPO sector are doing and can do.
Maybe just to add on, since I think the question was also about, this, whether from consumers you have to go now. In services, you will have a mix of both. You will have, in certain sectors, actually consumers coming to your country, and that's increasingly happening, whether it's the experience of the Southeast Asian countries in medical tourism, or in many other experiences, education, for example, now. So therefore, there will be, so you are a producer in that sense, but someone else is consuming in your country. That model is very much something which is happening, and in particular sectors, this is the way to go, certainly. The second, of course, would be where you yourself, the country exporting, would become a producer. And there I think one of the points that Richard made is this entire category of business services. And I'll broaden it even more. It's not just business outsourcing, but business services in general, which is, of course, a very large category. And if you look at the growth in fact, in the business services exports of many countries is even higher than the growth in ITS services. It's the case now almost with India that business services or parts of it are becoming important. And that is a combination of different ways. Part of it is outsourcing, but that's not the only model. So I think in services, if you try and fix yourself on one particular model, I think that's perhaps not the way to go. Different sectors will require perhaps different approaches to export and getting the footprint. So I think a one-size-fits-all, by the very nature of services, will not perhaps work.
Thank you so much. With that, we're going to have to finish. I'm sorry we couldn't get to the other questions, but we have really run out of time, and some people still have more commitments to attend. So thank you so much to my panel, to the World Bank for the partnership, and to the UK for the first contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. What a fabulous. I wish we could go on and on and on.
It is a fascinating subject. It is.
Good job for what